The screams were reportedly audible for kilometers. The summer of 1462. You serve as an Ottoman soldier in the most formidable army on. Constantinople is under your control. You've brought down empires. To put an end to a renegade prince, you are marching into the small principality of Wallachia. Weeks or even days should pass. Then you detect its scent. Rot, death, something else you can't quite put your finger on. It slows down your column. The scouts are no longer in motion. And you see it when you round the hill close to the capital city. A woodland. However, the trees aren't actually trees. They are people. 20,000 of them. As far as the eye can view, your brothers and allies are raised into the air on wooden poles in flawless geometric rows. Some have been dead for weeks, and their bodies are black and swollen. Others continue to scream, breathe, and move. After only one glance, your sultan, the man who overthrew the Byzantine Empire, turns his whole army around. What type of mentality is capable of producing such a thing? This is the bit that should scare you. This was not insanity. It was a tactic. Cold, cunning, and terrifyingly successful. The tale you believe to be true about Vlad the Impaler is untrue. Not because it didn't occur, but rather because the reality is far worse. This is the complete story of how one man successfully turned human pain into a weapon, altering the trajectory of entire civilizations. And by the time it's all over, you'll see that what was truly horrifying was not what he did to bodies but rather what he did to minds. Let's begin with a query that no one ever poses. What destroys a person to such an extent that they are able to do this? It is 1442. Vlad is 11 years old. Vlad II, also known as Vlad the Dragon, his father, recently struck a bargain with the devil. Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire is a real person with a name, not just a metaphor. It's an easy deal. In Wallachia, Vlad II retains his throne. He gives over his two youngest sons as captives in return, using them as collateral to ensure his allegiance. Thus, young Vlad and his brother Radu are transported to the center of the Ottoman Empire after being ripped from their home. Instead of being held captive in dungeons, they were visitors to the Aduan and later Agria's palaces. They receive military training, education, and elegant clothing. The Quran, philosophy, Arabic, and Turkish are all taught to them. It appears to be privilege at first glance. However, the history books ignore this. This was not learning. It was psychological warfare. Between the ages of 11 and 17, Vlad witnessed his captors perfect the skill of empire building during his formative years. He researched the Ottomans' use of terror as a form of control. He saw public executions intended to traumatize entire populations into submission in addition to serving as a form of punishment. He discovered that dread was more potent than any army when used with surgical precision. He also discovered something else. He had no power at all. Vlad refused to change, whereas his younger brother Radu did, even becoming good friends with Mehmed, the Sultan's son. Ottoman court documents state that he was regularly disciplined for his disobedience. According to some reports, he may have been tortured and beaten. History has erased the specifics, but one thing is certain. During those years, something basic snapped inside of him. Or possibly more precisely, a crystallized substance. He developed what contemporary psychologists would refer to as a persecution complex. He channeled his compulsive drive for control. He studied every penalty he received. He committed every method of torture he saw to memory. He was gradually assembling his mental weaponry. After being held captive for 6 years, in 1448 at last, Vlad went back to Wallachia. He was 17. 2 months later, rival boyars, nobles who supported both the Ottomans and the Hungarians, killed his father. Misha, his elder brother, was interred alive. Vlad was by himself, surrounded by adversaries, and had no support. This is where the narrative becomes intriguing. He was not merely seeking retribution. He desired to create a universe that reflected his trauma. He would take all he had learnt about terror from the Ottomans and turn it into something they had never seen before. He had to wait first, though. Vlad remained in exile for an additional 6 years, during which time he planned, plotted, studied military strategy, and engaged in political scheming. Click subscribe if you're intrigued by the recorded psychological turning points that produced the most infamous people in history. The story of how this broken youngster turned into something much worse than his captors could have predicted is just getting begun. In 1456, Vlad's coronation feast ought to have been a joyous occasion. Rather, it became the model for everything that came after. The same aristocrats who had planned his father's murder and buried his brother alive were the boy family he invited. Believing they were coming to swear allegiance to the new prince, hundreds of them showed up in their best attire. The big hall had been furnished. There was a plenty of wine. Then, in the midst of the feast, Vlad got up and posed a straightforward query. "How many Lycian princes have you experienced?" With pride, the elder boy said, 710. Some people say they can recall 12 different rulers. They were boasting of their capacity to outlive every prince who held the throne, their political acumen, and their survival. Vlad grinned. He then issued an order. Every boy who responded was immediately taken into custody. However, this is when the systematic mind comes into play. He didn't put them to death. Not quite yet. Rather, he divided them into two groups according to their health and age. The older ones, the masterminds behind his family's demise. Just beyond the palace walls, they were impaled. Not very fast. In order to ensure that they would die gradually over hours or days, the stakes were carefully inserted to avoid essential organs. What followed had their screams as the music. After being deprived of their aristocratic attire, the younger, more powerful boyars and their families marched 50 miles north to the ruins of Penari Castle. They were presented with an option there that wasn't truly a choice. Use their bare hands to rebuild the stronghold or perish. They carried stones up the mountainside for months. They labored until their hands began to bleed, their expensive clothing began to deteriorate, and they passed out from tiredness. The majority perished while work was underway. The surviving were never the same. The old nobility had been virtually eliminated by Vlad, and a new class that owed him everything and lived in constant fear of his wrath had taken their place. This was more than retaliation. The power structure that had weakened Lycia was methodically dismantled. Additionally, it disclosed an important aspect of Vlad's mentality. He desired more than just compliance. His goal was to thoroughly shatter them such that their only option was to comply. However, this was still internal politics. Lion was the boy. Vlad's next move would rock entire civilizations. Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same Mehmed who had been Vlad's childhood friend, sent envoys to Lycia in 1459 and demanded the yearly tribute that Vlad's father had promised to pay. There was another insult attached to the demand. Vlad was required to personally appear in Constantinople in order to reaffirm his vassalage pledge. The envoys anticipated the customary political theater when they arrived. Maybe a counteroffer, maybe some negotiating. They were given a sneak peek at hell. Vlad asked them to explain their ritual as they entered his court and refused to take off their turbans, which were an actual religious habit in Ottoman procedure. They did, presumably relieved that he didn't seem upset but rather interested in understanding. Vlad gave a contemplative nod. Then he spoke something that must have caused their blood to freeze. "A man who fully upholds his faith is someone I admire. Allow me to assist you in honoring it indefinitely." He gave his guards the command to nail the turbans straight to their heads. Consider how deliberate that cruelty was. They weren't killed by him. To make sure they would survive the trip back to Constantinople, he disfigured them in a way that was both medically measured and symbolically significant. As they ran back to the Sultan, their screams reverberated throughout the countryside, serving as walking messages. Mehmed realized right once that the men he had sent in good faith were not the childhood friend he remembered when he received his envoys, who were now permanently deformed and driven almost insane by agony. This was something new, something that had transformed the horror lessons learnt by the Ottomans into something even they could not have predicted. Now, war was unavoidable. However, Vlad had more messages to convey before that battle broke out. This is what the majority of people are unaware of regarding impalement. It went beyond simple execution. It was engineering. A spike pushed directly through the torso, as seen in the popular image, would kill nearly immediately. That defeats the entire goal. Vlad's approach was vastly more brutal and far more complex. Here is how it really operated, based on surviving Ottoman reports and modern medical analysis of the descriptions. The victim was first placed face down. The spike was placed through the rectum after being properly chosen, lubricated, and rounded at the tip. Here's the important information. In order to avoid all important organs and blood vessels, it was inserted at a precise angle. After that, the sufferer was gradually brought upright, and gravity took care of the rest. Their own body weight would progressively push the stake upward through their torso over hours or even days. The route was designed to bypass major arteries, the heart, and the lungs. In certain recorded instances, the sufferer would live for up to 3 days before the stake eventually came out through the shoulder or chest. Why this approach? Because Vlad had an understanding that is now confirmed by professionals in psychological warfare. Seeing someone suffer for a long time is far more traumatizing than seeing someone die quickly. A beheading on the battlefield is terrible but fleeting. Screams may be heard throughout entire valleys during the days-long impalement spectacle. However, the physical act was just one part of it. If we may use such a warped term, the true talent was in the staging. Vlad would impale captives somewhere that would maximize publicity, such as in public squares, along busy roads, and outside city gates. He was aware that the psychological effects would be multiplied well beyond the actual number of victims due to word of mouth and rumors. 100 witnesses to an impalement would produce 100 storytellers, each of whom would tell 100 more. Additionally, he continuously improved the symbology. Depending on rank, the stakes varied in height. Nobles are higher, peasants are closer to the ground, and enemy leaders are at the top. His point was strengthened by the hideous visual hierarchy this produced. In my world, everyone has a place, and everyone will suffer in accordance with their status. According to some reports, he placed the impaled victims in concentric rings, stars, circles, and other geometric shapes. It wasn't random sadism. It was an act of control. It stated, "I have so much power that I can turn human suffering into art." Vlad is described eating among the impaled in a 1462 German booklet, which is undoubtedly propaganda but is based on first-hand reports from Saxon traders in Wallachia. He supposedly put up a table in the center of a field of stakes, ate his meals in front of those who were dying, and appeared to enjoy the experience. Whether this particular incident actually occurred as stated is up for debate. The psychological message, however, is undeniable. I am so much above your comprehension of human behavior that I am unaffected by your fear. These tracts were widely distributed by the Saxons, who had a problematic relationship with Vlad of their own. They included woodcut pictures and were among the earliest horror stories in European history to be published in large quantities. Crude but powerful, these pictures went viral throughout Europe and solidified Vlad's reputation. This is the question that no one was posing, though. Did any of these work? Was using terror as a military tactic really successful? Or was Vlad merely a powerful sadist? In the summer of 1462, the solution was revealed. Additionally, it would demonstrate that Vlad's strategies were not only successful but even extremely so. At last, Sultan Mehmed II had had enough. In addition to refusing to pay tribute, Vlad had started attacks far into Ottoman territory south of the Danube by the beginning of 1462. According to his own letter to the Hungarian monarch, he killed almost 23,000 people during a particularly terrible expedition in which he entered Ottoman territory with a little force. He even maintained a corpse count, classifying the victims according to their gender and age. Mehmed, who had overrun Constantinople at the age of 21, put an end to numerous uprisings, and commanded the world's most potent military apparatus, made the decision to personally deal with the Wallachia issue. He raised an army of roughly 60,000 to 90,000 soldiers in the spring of 1462. Even conservative estimates place it at more than 3 times Wallachia's total military-age male population, though the precise figure is lost to history. This was an eradication, not an invasion. Vlad had between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers in all. Many of them were unskilled peasant conscripts. A traditional conflict would be a slaughter. Vlad then carried out the plan he had had since he was a young boy. He declined to engage them in a traditional conflict. When the Ottoman troops arrived at Wallachia, they discovered nothing. Burned farms, poisoned wells, and abandoned settlements. All possible food and water sources had been methodically eliminated. Vlad had given the order for his own people to flee their homes and take their cattle with them into the mountains and forests. The Ottoman supply lines grew progressively longer before the nighttime raids started. These weren't your average skirmishes. Vlad had taught guerrilla warfare to specialized units. Before any coordinated response could materialize, small groups of men, perhaps 50 to 100, would attack Ottoman encampment in the dark of night, killing hundreds, starting fires, and vanishing. They went after ammo depots, pack animals, and supply wagons. Defeating the army was not the objective. It was intended to wear them out, demoralize them, and make them paranoid. However, the masterpiece was created on the evening of June 17, 1462. Sultan Mehmed himself was camped close to Targoviste with his personal guard, the elite janissaries. Vlad had learned from captured Ottoman troops. There would never be another chance like this one. In what became known as the night attack, Vlad personally commanded a troop of roughly 10,000 soldiers. They entered the enormous Ottoman camp under cover of darkness with the sole intention of assassinating the Sultan. According to modern sources, there is complete chaos. The Wallachans knew enough Turkish to be confusing, and they were outfitted in captured Ottoman costumes. They especially targeted the area of camp where the Sultan's pavilion was located, set fire to tents, and ran over horses. They were only a few yards away from Mehmed. According to some historians, Vlad and the Sultan briefly made eye contact across the flaming camp, but the janissaries resisted, encircling their commander in a protective circle. After fighting in close quarters for hours, Vlad came to the conclusion that he was unable to break through. His warriors disappeared back into the night as abruptly as they had emerged after he gave the command to retire. Although Ottoman accounts minimized the figures, the Ottoman deaths were very low, around 2,000. However, the psychological harm was disastrous. A heavily outnumbered enemy that emerged out of nowhere and vanished like ghosts had almost slain the Ottoman Empire's Sultan in the midst of his own army. Mehmed's superiors were shaken. Even though they were still weeks away from Constantinople, his weary soldiers were moving through a desolate area where any shadow could conceal an adversary. When they arrived at the capital, they discovered what Vlad had been getting ready for them. What Mehmed's army faced on the way to Targoviste in late June 1462 cannot be adequately described in writing. However, we can attempt. Consider yourself an Ottoman soldier. You had been marching across burnt ground for weeks. Because of the frequent night raids, you're hungry, worn out, and agitated. It had been days since you last saw the enemy. They simply disappeared. That ought to be encouraging. It seems like a trap. The first thing you notice as you get closer to the Wallachia capital is the scent. Multiply the number of times you've smelt a dead animal rotting in the summer heat. Add the lovely, sickening smell of rotting human flesh after that. You can taste it because it's so thick. The stakes are then visible. After the first 1, 10, and 100, you come to the conclusion that there is no end. They extend in all directions to the horizon. According to current sources, the field of impaled bodies was more than half a mile wide and nearly 2 miles long. The precise number is disputed by contemporary historians. Ottoman sources assert 10,000, most likely downplaying for propaganda purposes. Up to 20,000 are claimed by Wallachia and Hungarian sources. The actual number of impaled bodies is most likely between 15,000 and 20,000. However, this is what gives you the creeps. This wasn't at random. With concentric rings extending from the capital height ordered rows, the stakes were set up in exact geometric designs. They create star patterns in some places that are visible from higher terrain. Vlad had been working on this for weeks, if not months. From previous assaults and border battles, he had captured Ottoman soldiers and sympathizers. He had kept them alive only for this. A few of the corpses had been decaying in the summer heat for weeks. Some were reportedly still alive, while others had recently been impaled. The moaning of the dying could be heard throughout the pitch, according to the Byzantine writer Ionikos Chalakandoulis, who spoke with eyewitnesses. Some were still conscious but too weak to scream after being impaled for days, their bodies slowly digesting themselves. It is said that the hardened veterans of the Ottoman army, who had taken over cities and massacred innumerable adversaries, started throwing up. Some declined to go any farther. Others began to flee in the middle of the night, eager to face being put to death rather than endure this horror. Hamza Pasha, a senior Ottoman commander who had been taken prisoner during a previous battle, was at the center, on the tallest stake of all. The Sultan's path was immediately in front of his body, which was clad in the last of his military regalia. Vlad sent Mehmed a private message. "I treat your best men like this. Just think about what I'll do to you." Recall that Sultan Mehmed II ordered his fair share of deaths and killings, witnessed Constantinople's walls fall beneath his cannons, and allegedly halted his horse and gazed in quiet for a few minutes. Although there are other accounts of his reaction, Chaka Kandils is the most commonly acknowledged that a guy who has accomplished such great things cannot be deprived of his nation. A man who had done such things was highly valuable, but who knew how to use his power. It wasn't a compliment. It was acknowledgement. The Sultan was admitting that he was dealing with something he didn't entirely comprehend. A genius that had transformed Ottoman techniques into something that even the Ottomans were unable to equal. The state of the military was already getting worse. Supply chains were overburdened. The scorched earth strategy has proven effective. Morale has been devastated by the night raids. Retreat was advised by the Sultan's own commanders. However, the psychological tipping point was the forest of the Impaled. It demonstrated that traditional military reasoning was inapplicable on this situation. Vlad had no intention in winning fights. His goal was to break people's minds. It was also effective. Mehmed issued an order for a general retreat within days. To keep pestering Vlad, he left a contingent under Radu, Vlad's younger brother. However, the Sultan himself and the major force withdrew. The world's most formidable military army had overrun a small principality and was repulsed by psychological warfare rather than actual loss. Vlad the Impaler had prevailed. However, the story doesn't stop there, since the last catastrophe is revealed in what follows. Despite its short-term effectiveness, that dread inevitably consumes its possessor in the end. You would expect that Vlad would become a hero in Christian Europe for overthrowing the Ottoman Empire. Did in certain respects. His defense of Christianity was commended by the Pope and the monarch of Hungary. However, this is what they failed to comprehend. Vlad was unable to switch it off. The Ottomans were not the end of the strategies used to combat them. He applied them to everyone. Vlad was punishing Lycian merchants for price gouging by the end of 1462. Based on rumors, he was impaling boyars who were allegedly disloyal. For small transgressions, he was impaling entire communities. The weapon he had created to vanquish a more formidable foe had evolved into his sole tool. His political standing quickly declined. As Vlad's increasingly unpredictable behavior alienated his allies, his brother Radu, supported by Ottoman wealth and men, positioned himself as the sensible alternative. Hungarian backing vanished. Only a few months after his biggest victory, in November 1462, Vlad was compelled to escape into Hungarian territory. The cruel irony is as follows. King Mehmed Corvinus of Hungary, his purported ally, imprisoned him on allegations that are still unclear. According to other accounts, Matthias made up letters to give the impression that Vlad was in talks with the Ottomans. Some claim that even Vlad's Christian allies wanted him removed because he had become such a liability. He was imprisoned in Hungary for 12 years. House detention in cozy lodgings, rather than the harsh confinement of his Ottoman childhood. He even had children after marrying a noble woman from Hungary. He was a model prisoner by all accounts, until opportunity came back in 1476. Under a string of incompetent leaders, Wallachia had descended into anarchy. With the support of Hungarian and Moravian forces, Stephen the Great, the Prince of Moravia, assisted in arranging Vlad's restoration to the throne. In November 1476, Vlad regained the throne. He might have ruled for 2 months. The precise date is lost in either January 1477 or December 1476. Vlad lost his life in combat with an Ottoman army close to Bucharest. The situation is unclear. According to some accounts, he was assassinated by his own soldiers, either by betrayal or because they thought he was an enemy among the mayhem. Others claim that Ottoman forces overpowered him. The aftermath is certain. As evidence of his demise, his head was severed, preserved in honey, and delivered to Sultan Mehmed in Constantinople. Vlad ended himself as a trophy on display for ridicule in the capital of the exact empire he had fought his entire life for, despite everything: the fear, the impalement, and the psychological warfare. According to reports, his body was interred at the Snagov Monastery on a Romanian island. A tomb was discovered during excavations in the 1930s, however it was empty. Nobody is aware of Vlad's true whereabouts as of yet. What should we do with this tale? Then, Vlad is frequently hailed as a national hero in Romania, a ruthless but successful leader who upheld independence in the face of insurmountable obstacles. He is shown in statues. His likeness can be found on travel-related products. His name was loosely borrowed by the rest of the world, particularly following Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula. Vlad came to be associated with supernatural evil and vampirism, which paradoxically absolves us of responsibility. It's simpler to imagine him as an unnatural monster than to face the actual horror. Because this is the true horror. Vlad was human in all he did. Terrifyingly, painfully human. He wasn't a monster from birth. He was produced by a system that taught him that terror is the source of power. Absolute cruelty is necessary for that survival. Empathy is a sign of weakness. And he applied those principles to their logical conclusion. It wasn't insanity in the forest of the Impaled. Applied psychology was the subject. The attacks during the night weren't acts of random brutality. They were military tactics with precision. Every public display of anguish, every impalement, and every mutilation was a premeditated move in a bigger game. This is what should keep you up at night. It was successful. Vlad used only calculated terror to turn back an empire against all odds. He demonstrated that terror, when used as a weapon, could achieve goals that armies were unable to. Whether Vlad was evil is not the question. That's clear. What does it indicate about human nature that this approach worked so well? What other planned atrocities lurk in the shadows of history, ready to impart lessons we'd prefer not to learn? Subscribe if you want to continue learning the unsettling facts that textbooks conceal. Because the darkest moments in history are about more than just what took place. They aim to comprehend why it was successful. We cannot afford to lose sight of this truth.